I've always loved staying home alone. There's a sense of freedom in having the house to myself. The silence, the stillness, the time to just exist without interruption. But after last summer, I'll never feel safe in an empty house again. It was late July, during one of those storms that seemed to carry on forever. My parents had gone to visit my grandparents for the weekend, leaving me in charge of the house. I was 17 and confident, maybe too confident. I'd told them I'd be fine, even teased my mom for worrying too much. The first half of the evening was perfect. Rain tapped gently against the windows, lightning flickered in the distance, and the smell of popcorn lingered in the air as I curled up on the couch to watch a classic slasher film. The movie was predictable, full of jump scares and bad decisions, but that was part of the fun. Around 10 p.m., as the credits rolled, I stretched and switched off the TV. The room fell silent, save for the steady hum of the storm outside. It was comforting in a way, the kind of night that felt tailor-made for staying in. I got up to grab a snack, my socked feet padding softly across the wooden floor. That's when I heard it. It was faint, just a single creak, almost lost beneath the rain. It came from upstairs, from the direction of my room. I froze, straining to listen. When nothing followed, I told myself it was the house settling. Old houses make noises, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Shaking it off, I made my way to the kitchen. I rummaged through the cabinets and settled on a bag of chips, tearing it open and munching absent-mindedly. That's when the feeling hit me. Have you ever had the distinct sensation that you're being watched? It's not something you can explain. It's more primal, like your body knows something your brain hasn't registered yet. I felt it then, a prickle at the back of my neck, a weight pressing on my chest. I tried to laugh it off, blaming the horror movie I'd just watched, but I couldn't shake the unease. I turned, and that's when I saw it. The back door. It was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze, rainwater pooling on the floor. My heart jumped into my throat. I was sure, absolutely sure, I had locked it earlier. I hurried over and shut it, twisting the lock with trembling fingers. Then I noticed the footprints. They were faint, muddy tracks leading from the door and into the hallway. My breath hitched. They weren't mine. They couldn't be. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that felt intentional. I moved cautiously down the hallway, knife in hand, checking every corner and doorway. The footprints disappeared near the base of the stairs. My heart pounded as I realized what that meant. Whoever had been in the house, or was still in the house, had gone upstairs. Every horror movie I'd ever seen screamed at me to leave, to run to the neighbors and call the police. But I didn't. Some mix of fear and adrenaline pushed me forward, up the creaking staircase. The hallway upstairs was darker than it should have been. One of the light bulbs was out, casting deep shadows along the walls. I started with my parents' room. Empty. Then the bathroom. Nothing. Finally, I reached my room. The door was open. Not much, just enough to show a sliver of my room beyond. My stomach churned as I pushed it open with my foot, knife raised. At first glance, everything seemed normal. My bed was still made, my desk untouched. But then my eyes landed on the closet. The door was slightly open. My mind raced. I never leave the closet door open. Slowly, I approached, each step feeling like it took an eternity. As I got closer, I heard it, a faint, raspy breath. My blood turned to ice. I couldn't do it. I bolted, running down the stairs and out the front door, not stopping until I reached my neighbor's house. I banged on the door until they let me in, my words tumbling out in a frantic mess. The police arrived within minutes. They searched the house, their radios crackling as they called out room by room. Then they found him. He was in my closet. The man was thin and pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His greasy hair clung to his face as he clutched a crowbar in one hand. On the floor beside him was a backpack containing rope, duct tape, and plastic sheeting. He didn't resist as the officers hauled him out. He didn't speak, didn't even blink. But the worst part came later, when the officers reviewed the security footage. He'd been in the house for hours. They watched him slip in through the unlocked back door just after sunset. For hours, he moved around the house, watching me from the shadows. At one point, he was standing just feet behind me while I made popcorn. I can't stop thinking about what would have happened if I'd opened that closet door, if I'd hesitated even a moment longer. Now, even the smallest sound makes my heart race. I double-check every lock, every window. But no matter what I do, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still out there, watching. It started on a Tuesday evening, like any other. I had just finished dinner, the last of the warm pasta in my bowl now gone, and was settling onto the couch for some quiet reading. The house was empty, the usual hum of suburban life outside muted by the cozy stillness of my home. As I opened my book and adjusted the cushion beneath me, a sound broke the silence. A soft scratching. I paused, my head tilting instinctively toward the sound, coming from the wall behind me. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like fingernails lightly raking across wood. Probably mice, I thought, shaking my head. Old houses like mine were bound to have rodents now and then. It was nothing to be alarmed about. I made a mental note to call pest control in the morning and returned to my reading. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. The following night, it came again. At first, it was just a faint noise, but it was louder this time. And it seemed to move, almost like something was traveling through the walls, scratching, scurrying. From the living room, it drifted toward the kitchen. I put the book down, leaning forward slightly. This wasn't just the usual creaking of an old house settling. Something was definitely off. But still, I convinced myself, it's probably just rodents again. No need to overreact. But as the nights passed, the sounds grew more distinct. By the third night, the scratching wasn't the only thing I heard. Thuds. Soft, echoing thuds. Occasional creaks. The noises seemed to come from every direction. Sometimes above me, sometimes below. There was no obvious source. I spent the next day searching the house. I checked the attic, the crawl spaces, the basement. I looked for cracks, holes, any signs of an infestation, droppings, gnawed wood nests. But I found nothing. The walls were intact, the floors solid. No sign of pests. Not even a hint of damage. It didn't make sense. That night, the noises escalated. The scratching grew frantic, almost desperate, like something, or someone was trapped. It wasn't just in one spot anymore. It came from all sides, from every corner of the house. The walls groaned under the pressure, and I could hear something heavy shifting behind them. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, heart pounding as the sounds clawed at my sanity. My fingers gripped the sheets tightly, the only thing grounding me as I stared up at the ceiling. I didn't dare move. The noise was everywhere, and just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. I lay there in the dark, too terrified to sleep. Every creak, every whisper of sound felt amplified. It was as if the house was listening, waiting. For the next 2 days, it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that gnaws at your nerves. I convinced myself it was over. Whatever it had been, whatever had been making those sounds, had left or died. But on the third night, it started again. This time, it was different. No more scratching. No more thudding. It was a deep, resonant groan. A sound like wood bending under immense pressure. The walls of the house seemed to breathe with it, like the very structure was alive. I couldn't sit still. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured down the hallway, my pulse thudding in my ears. I tried to listen closely, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. It reverberated through the floorboards, the ceiling, and the walls. It was as though the house was humming, a rhythm, a pulse that I could almost feel in my bones. The sound was pulling me somewhere. My feet moved almost on their own, guiding me to the basement. The basement. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness. I rarely went down there. It was unfinished, cold, damp, a place where shadows lingered longer than they should. The air down there always felt thick, oppressive, like it carried a history I didn't want to uncover. But the sound called to me, and I descended. With each step, the groaning grew louder, more pronounced. By the time I reached the bottom, I could hear the faint whispers accompanying it. The whispers weren't words, just a soft murmur, like wind threading through cracks. But there was no wind. The noise pulled me into the far corner of the basement, where the foundation wall met the floor. The concrete was cracked, and from those fissures seeped a dark, viscous substance. It glistened in the flashlight beam, like tar or oil. I was hypnotized. The noise, the whispers, the black substance. It all seemed to converge on this single spot, an epicenter of something that shouldn't be. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and brushed the crack in the wall. The moment I touched it, the house shuddered beneath me. The groaning sound intensified, deepened, resonating through the floor and walls. A creak, low and guttural, echoed, vibrating through the beams of the house. I froze. The noise wasn't just an old house settling. It wasn't the sound of pests or pipes or the wind. The house itself was alive. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet, my heart racing as the walls seemed to groan in response, like the house was reacting to my presence. I turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. But even as I ran, the sound followed. The groaning, the creaking, the whispers. It wasn't fading. It was closing in. I reached for my car keys, my hand shaking, and sprinted out the front door. I didn't stop to check behind me. I didn't even look back. I fumbled for my keys in the car, slamming the door shut. My hands were shaking as I pressed the emergency button and called 911. I parked a few blocks away, heart still hammering, as I waited for the police to arrive. They searched the house thoroughly. When they came back outside, their faces were pale. They hadn't found anything, nothing tangible, but there was something off, something unexplainable. I never returned to the house after that night. The house, it wasn't just shelter. It wasn't just a structure made of wood and nails. It had a presence, an ancient one, lurking behind the walls, beneath the floors. And I had been living inside it, unaware, until it called out to me. Now, when I pass that street, I can't help but glance at the house. It stands there, silent, watching, waiting, and I know deep down that it's still alive. Growing up in a small town, life was simple but isolating. I was an only child, and my parents worked tirelessly to make ends meet. They had multiple jobs between them, always working long hours or taking overtime shifts to pay the bills. Most days, I would come home from school, snack, and find something to occupy my time alone in the house. By the time I was 14, I was used to being on my own. It wasn't uncommon for both of my parents to be at work late into the night, and I would stay in the house until they returned, usually around 10 or 11 p.m. On most nights, I'd just sit on the couch watching TV, or maybe read a book. But when I needed to clear my head, I'd go for a walk in the woods behind our house. The trail was a peaceful, 2.5 mile path through the trees, mostly secluded. I had been walking it for years and had never really seen anyone else on it, except for the occasional hiker or jogger passing through during the daytime. It was my quiet, safe space, away from the noise of home. That afternoon, after school and a quick snack, I decided to go out for my usual walk. The weather was nice, and I figured it would help me clear my mind. I set out as the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. The trail started just behind our yard and wound its way through the woods, eventually leading to a small clearing where a creek ran through. About a mile into my walk, I noticed something strange. A man was sitting on the trail up ahead. He was slumped against a tree, his back resting against the trunk. At first, I thought maybe he was just taking a break. I could barely make out his face under the brim of his red baseball cap, which was tilted low, obscuring most of his features. He wore a dark blue jacket, and his posture was slouched, as if he had been there for a while. I slowed down as I got closer, instinctively trying not to disturb him. The trail was narrow, and I didn't want to get too close, but there was something about the way he was sitting there, so still, that made me uneasy. He didn't move or acknowledge my presence, so I tried to quietly pass by him. Just as I was almost level with him, he suddenly looked up. His eyes met mine, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. His eyes were bloodshot, tired and red, like he hadn't slept in days. And his frown, it wasn't just a neutral expression, it was a look of deep irritation or anger. Something in the way he stared at me made my stomach turn. I didn't want to linger. I quickened my pace, now walking briskly, then jogging, until I was nearly running down the trail. I kept my eyes on the ground, trying to ignore the feeling of his gaze still burning into my back. I didn't hear him follow, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. I couldn't get rid of the image of his face, or the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. By the time I made it home, I was winded and a little shaken. I quickly locked all the doors, something I did automatically when my parents weren't home. But tonight, I felt a strong, irrational need to make sure everything was secure. The silence in the house seemed louder than usual. I even double-checked the windows, just to be sure. But when I finally sat down in front of the TV to try to distract myself, something was off. My mind kept drifting back to the man in the woods. Just as I started to relax again, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, a voice calling out. I paused the TV, my heart skipping a beat. "Hello?" the voice called, barely audible. I wasn't sure if I had heard it right, so I waited in silence. Then again, "Hello?" It was coming from the back door. I felt my stomach twist into knots. I stood up and walked quietly toward the hallway, heart pounding in my chest. Peering through the back door's glass, I could see him. The man from the woods. He was standing at the door, his face pressed against the glass, trying to look inside. His red cap was now fully visible, his expression twisted with some strange, unsettling emotion. He didn't say anything more, but he didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to fill me with fear. I pulled away from the door and backed into the living room. I didn't know what to do. The house felt too quiet, too still. My mind raced. Should I call the police? Should I hide? The man outside didn't move. For a long time, he just stood there, staring through the glass. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. He reached for the handle. The door rattled as he tried to twist it. He didn't knock. He didn't have to. He was trying to force his way in. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I could hear the creaking of the wood, the pressure of the door being pushed against its lock. With every attempt, I felt the panic rising in my chest. What was he going to do? Why was he here? I stayed completely still, hoping he couldn't hear my heart pounding. The sound of the door handle shaking was deafening. He tried again and again to force the door open, but after what felt like forever, the attempts finally stopped. I didn't know if he was still out there or if he had given up. I didn't dare move for several minutes, just listening, watching through the crack in the curtains. But when I couldn't hear him anymore, I did the only thing I could think to do. I called my parents. They were at work, of course, but my dad picked up after the second ring. I told him what happened in a panic, and he immediately called the police. It felt like hours before they arrived, though it was probably only a few minutes. I stayed huddled in the corner of my room, shaking, waiting for someone to tell me it was all just a mistake. The police searched the area around the house, but the man was gone. They found nothing. No trace of him anywhere. Later that night, when my parents came home, I could tell they didn't really understand how terrified I was. They were relieved I was safe, but they thought maybe it was just some prank. Maybe it was someone who got lost on the trail and was looking for help, they suggested. But I knew better. I'll never forget the look on his face. The anger. The way he stared at me like I was something to be dealt with. I don't know what he wanted, but I'll never be able to shake the feeling that he wasn't just looking for help. There was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. I couldn't go back to that trail for weeks after that night. I still avoid it, even now, whenever I'm home alone. Every time I pass by the trees, I feel like someone is watching me from the shadows, waiting to step out of the woods. And I'll never be able to shake the question, what would have happened if I hadn't locked the door?